What happens when a person moves beyond adolescence? Well, things unfold very differently, and here we should at least briefly mention a few examples. The need for communication is one of those needs whose development can tell us a lot about a person's personality. Take the well-known gourmands of communication, comparable even to gluttons when it comes to the need for food. This is clearly Nozdroyev from Gogol, where it's obvious there's no natural need to communicate with such intensity, and no social norms are being followed. We probably suspect that such an overdevelopment of the need for communication speaks volumes about personal problems. However, I'd like to provide another example. We often encounter situations, and I want to distinguish between two concepts here: loneliness and solitude. We often find cases where a person, intentionally or not, withdraws from communication and social contact. While not strictly defined, I hope the everyday distinction between loneliness and solitude is clear. Loneliness versus solitude. Loneliness, in this context, without further explanation, is likely linked to occupying a specific social position. Think of a social outcast or a misanthrope, like in Molière's famous play The Misanthrope, which inspired Alexander Griboyedov's well-known comedy, Woe from Wit. Such a deliberately lonely person, who intentionally removes themselves from society, still occupies a social position, and their personal development occurs within that framework. Solitude, however, is something more nuanced. We likely recall a famous example: the great 20th century French writer Marcel Proust. Outwardly, by social standards, he appeared to be an intentional misanthrope. He spent all his days locked away, only emerging at night, even to meet with friends. There were many who considered themselves his friends, respecting his work. Yet he rarely communicated with them, often only corresponding through letters, and no one ever entered the room where he lived and created. When Marcel Proust passed away, his friends entered his room and discovered a stack of school notebooks on his desk. Proust had died after placing the final period in his multi-volume novel, In Search of Lost Time. So, let's ponder together. Did Marcel Proust communicate, and with whom, during his solitude? Perhaps the answer will sound a bit lofty, but the loftiness is appropriate here. He communicated with humanity. He communicated with the potential readers of his novel. And it must be said, as often happens, not all of his contemporaries fully understood Proust's novel, but we, people of a later era, understand this text better and better. Therefore, in a sense, Marcel Proust communicated with us, communicating through the text he created, the novel he created, and, more broadly, the cultural object he created. Personal communication and cultural objects. Personal communication is a dialogue through cultural objects. It's not necessarily about being in direct social contact with your communication partner anymore. If there is a text, and more broadly, a cultural object, then that becomes the condition, the necessary condition, for genuine personal communication. Finally, regarding this topic, it's fitting to recall Robinson Crusoe, whom we mentioned previously. Let's clarify once more. On the one hand, the figure of Robinson Crusoe on a deserted island, as a social individual, seems deprived of all contact. The island is uninhabited, but on the other hand, as a personality, he is undoubtedly a subject of communication, and again, a subject of communication with the world of culture. Remember why this hero survived on the deserted island? Precisely because he actively communicated and actively worked with cultural objects. He recreated culture. He found new ways to use the tools and cultural items he managed to save, and thanks to them, he survived. He recreated culture and thereby developed as a person.